Okay, let's make sure that we're...
And make sure it's a...
I have battery life, supposedly, and I should not be on mute. Not that some people wouldn't like that. Well, let me talk loud for a minute, and we'll get it going as we can. Then there's a little handout on the podium in the back. If you did not get one, Ms. Karen has some here. This is, some people had asked for this from last time. This is a family tree for Islam, and also how the relationship between Israelites and Edomites and others that make up the Arab population sort of falls. And I'll be more than happy if somebody asks for a copy of, so whoa, now we're definitely on. Whoa. I'm going to go over here now. Maybe not quite that loud. It sounds like stadium seating now. I feel like I have to be announcing a NASCAR race or something like that. The rodeo, yes. We had a rodeo when I lived in Jacksonville. It came every year, and they invite Methodist preachers to give the invocation. Lots of things happen up in East Texas. And one of my dear friends got up and gave the invocation, and it began, "Howdy, God." I thought, well, we're identifying, we're indigenous. May not be exactly how I'd start a prayer. Let's try it in a different way tonight, shall we? Father, we give you thanks, thanks that you love every person on this earth. There is not a single person who does not bring a response from your heart, which is that they come to know you in all of your fullness. We thank you that every person on this globe has been created in your image. There is that part of you in each of them, in each of us. We enable us to remember that as we interact with those around us. You help us to remember that these are your children. They may be distant cousins to us. We may consider them to be enemies sometimes in matters of politics or warfare. But they're your children. May we have a heart for them, even as we ask that you have a heart for us. In the name of Jesus tonight, amen. Okay, so welcome back to this is our third session of our look at the children of Abraham and their faith. We've talked so far about how Islam shares an enormous religious heritage with both Judaism and Christianity, but that there is a significant divergence of thinking that we ought never to gloss over in our well-meaning attempts to hold everything together and all get along and maybe buy the world a Coke or something. We know that there are over 1.6 estimated, well, they're not estimated Muslims. There are an estimated 1.6 Muslims. We're pretty sure that there are Muslims in the world today. It makes it the second largest religious grouping after Christianity, about 23% of the world's population, and growing faster than the Christian faith is, primarily due to the difference in birth rates, which are between those two different groups. We talked last week about the basic story of Muhammad, the founder of the religion. We also noted last week that some have questioned whether he actually ever lived, or whether he's simply kind of an Arab myth, no more real than say King Arthur was in our own heritage. Then we went to those 5 pillars of Islam. We talked about the Shahada, or the creed. That's the repetition of that creed. La ilaha illa Allah, there is no God but Allah. The 5 daily prayers, the Salah, those acts of devotion and prayer where a Muslim will face towards Mecca and will be prostrate on the ground praying. We talked about there is a giving of alms, a zakat, and it comes out to about 2.5–3% of one's income that is given if you're Muslim. It sounds like a real bargain if you think about our 10% tithe, but then if you think about what most Christians actually give, it might be kind of a step up. Talked about there's a fasting time during Ramadan, a Psalm, and then we talked about what is an obligation if they can do it possibly once in your life. There is a time for a Hajj or a pilgrimage to Mecca if you're physically, economically able. So tonight what we're going to talk about is some of the more principal beliefs of Islam, which has led to a few divisions within that faith, and also what their view of our faith is about. Now, I mentioned last time there's a difficulty in finding an image of Muhammad because of the iconophobic nature of much of Islam. They're not afraid of images, but there's an opposition to icons or images of any kind, much less one of the Prophet, whom some will say there is no human being capable of really, of ever really depicting the beauty and the grandeur of the Prophet's countenance. I suggested if you look really hard, you'll be able to find a few images all the same, thanks to the internet, which has sort of democratized all kinds of things that people didn't ever think about prior to that. In addition to the Granger portrait that we saw here just a few minutes ago, this is perhaps the most well-known of that portraits. There is a famous manuscript from the 1300s by a scholar known as Rashid al-Din, and it does include a rendering of the Prophet when he is visited by the angel Gabriel. Gabriel's the one that has the feathers. I'm not sure that's Gabriel any more than I'm sure that's Muhammad, but if you look at that Gabriel, you can see why angels' first words are always "fear not." There's one other image that is perhaps closer to the stereotype some folks in the West might have of Muhammad, with four men who probably the first four of the caliphs are the ones who would succeed him. You notice that in this rendering, Muhammad is shown with some flaming halos around his head and a Quran line open in the center. That is significant because, as we said last time, in the end, it is not the visual image of Muhammad which radiates out into the Muslim world. It is the literary one. That is, the collection of his visions of what he says are direct words from God, which becomes known as the Muslim Holy Book or the Quran. We might say just a short word here about how Islam spreads following his death. That was in 632 AD, or as it is styled in the Islamic calendar, 10 AH, 10 lunar years after the Hijrah, or the flight from Mecca to Medina. Now, let me just sort of be clear on this, just to remind you, Islam is a system that arises 600 years after Christianity, okay? That's one of the reasons why Muslims will say Jesus was a prophet, yes. One of 25 prophets, and they will include Abraham and all kinds of folks that you've heard of. But Muhammad, being 600 years later, is the better one because he has the sort of latest, greatest information. He has sort of update that Jesus doesn't have. It's Vision 6.0, if you will. Within 3 years of Muhammad's death, 635 AD, Muslim armies from the south move in unexpectedly to take over one of the most flourishing cities at the world. It is a town which has roots that stretch back to Alexander the Great and then the Roman Empire. It's a place of high culture and civilization and a thriving Christian community, a place that St. Paul will have visited when he went to the street called Straight. You remember this, a place held, in fact, as the illustrious city beloved by Christ, although we don't have any, Christ was ever there, and that is Damascus, Syria. We can say this became the first of the first of a long line of some conquest over Christianity. And the Byzantine emperor, who was the sort of Christian emperor, is reported to have said, following the fall of Damascus, after a 6-month-long siege, "Farewell, O Syria, what an excellent country this is for the enemy." And you can see here a picture of the Umayyad Mosque, which was built about 70 years after the conquest in Syria, 705 AD. It's indicative to note the way in which the new Muslim masters of Damascus treated the larger Christian population when they assumed headship of the city. According to one pretty good religious scholar, that's my daughter, and she is pretty good at this, Muslims allowed the Christians to practice their faith so long as they paid tribute to the Muslims. Now, part of the motivation for this was to provide revenue for an expanding empire, but we should note the primary goal seems to have been to punish Christians for the error of their beliefs by humbling them through the extraction of a poll tax. If this sounds familiar to you, in recent days, that's exactly what is happening now in some areas that have been conquered by ISIS, who are extracting a poll tax from people. You can either convert to Islam, or you can pay a substantial sum of money. If you do neither one of those, you are put to the death. Christians retain the right to believe in Jesus, but the actual practice of that belief is strongly discouraged. Displays of crosses, for example, banners, icons, all are outlawed. And if you know much about Eastern Orthodoxy, what will become 300 years after this, the Eastern Orthodox Church, based in Byzantium, we would now call it Istanbul. It has a large reliance upon icons as a part of their faith that are drawings of the religious saints. They're not intended to be worshipped, no. They are intended to be aids to worship, in the same way that perhaps later on for Catholics, having a rosary might do. In the same way, I'll just throw this out there, that if you've been on an Emmaus walk, and even more so, if you've ever given an Emmaus talk, you know they will hand you a little cross, a little clinging cross you put in your hand as you're speaking, and that is supposed to help you focus just a little bit. It also helps you not dig yourself into the pulpit if you're nervous, and you just crush that cross harder. It's not that these are to be worshipped, but they are aids to that. And so these things are all outlawed. And Christians likewise have to agree not to ride on saddles, but to ride bareback, and not to build their homes higher than the homes of their Muslim neighbors. And according to some traditions, when they pay their tribute or the jizya, they have to do so in an embarrassingly public ceremony in which they are hit on their backs as they pay. And what's the point of this? It is to reinforce the superiority of the Muslim faith. Now we can see from some maps just how quickly and how widespread Islam is. The earlier map shows how Islam advanced within 25 years after Muhammad's death to include not simply Syria, but most of the Middle East. Jerusalem itself surrenders to Islamic forces about 3 years after Damascus does, 638 AD. Then all of Palestine, and then soon afterwards Egypt to the west, and Iraq and Persia to the east. By 100 years later, though, in 750 or so AD, you can see that Muslims have not only moved eastward towards Pakistan and India, but Islam has spread across what had been one of the most critical centers of the Christian church, which was North Africa. We sometimes forget this. We're so used to the status quo now that Africa in the north is a Muslim area, but it is one of the most vital areas of the Christian faith up until this point, around 750 AD. The greatest theologian of the Christian church, who will set the agenda for the church for 1,000 years, is Augustine, and who comes from what we would call Libya, who comes from that whole area, Carthage. You can see it just around Tripoli. Muslim forces even advance across the strait there into Spain and parts of southern Italy. It is a stunning advance. And it is one that is not stopped until the Frenchman Charles Martel, who is the grandfather of Charlemagne, turns them back at the Battle of Tours, 732 AD. This is a significant battle, probably one of the most important in all of human history, because Martel's Franks, or Frenchmen, are not only vastly outnumbered, 4-1, they're virtually all infantry who don't have armor or bows or firearms, who somehow manage to withstand horsemen wearing chain mail, and that's a feat unheard of in history, really. Martel is also known as the Hammer, Charles the Hammer, not to be confused with Jim Adler, who is the Texas Hammer. Although there are some similarities if you look at them. The significance of the Battle of Tours is enormous to most historians because it stops the Muslim conquest of Europe, which already has a strong foothold in Spain. Now, even today, we can see an example of Islamic culture which flourishes in Spain, centered around the town of Cordoba. The cathedral, which is now there, is built as a mosque first in the 700s. Muslims are not finally expelled from Spain, now they're back, but they're not finally expelled from Spain until 1492. There are 780 years of Muslim control of that part of the world. Now, if 1492 sounds vaguely familiar to you, sail the ocean blue, it is the year Columbus sails eastward in search of a new trade route to the east, and instead makes his famous discovery and ends up opening up a whole new vista to the world. And one of the history's ironies, one we don't always get, it was the final defeat of the Muslims in Spain, and I'm not talking about Muslim theologians, about the Muslim warriors and armies. It's the final defeat of them which prompts the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, to want to do something big to honor God with their gratitude. And that something ends up being, well, we'll finance this rather whimsical expedition, which has already been turned down by everybody else across the entire continent. What is sometimes not remembered is that the reason that old Chris was looking for a new trade route to the east was because you couldn't go the other way that you used to go anymore. Because Islam had invaded Central Asia and defeated Constantinople, the name for Byzantium before it's Istanbul, had defeated it in 1453. So it cut off the overland route to the east for the Europeans. You couldn't go that way, so Chris thought, let's go this way and see if we can somehow get around to it. Islamic armies conquer most of what is Eastern Europe, in fact, until they are finally stopped at the gates of Vienna in 1683. Now, Interestingly enough, if you read Muslim histories, you will find that they will tell the story of Columbus just a little differently. They will suggest that Muslims in Spain were actually the more civilized and advanced race who had actually already discovered a route to America and designed ships that could sail it, but somehow never had the time to put their plans into action because war with the Christians had distracted them. But at least according to one story, before Granada was besieged by Christian armies and was lost to the Muslims, Christopher Columbus actually snuck in to Granada to consult with an old learned Muslim who told him, this is how you can get to America. I don't think he called it that, but it's just probably not accurate. This is probably just kind of a legend. But we ought to note that the legacy of the Muslim conquest of Spain still lingers on. Muslims become known by a different name in that part of Europe, whether it is the correct designation or not. They become known as the Moors, M-O-R-S. And the conquest between Christians and the Moors even spills over into the New World, where even today, one pretty well-known Mexican city right on our border has a name which means slayer of the Moors, Matamoros. So when you go down to Matamoros, you're seeing a vestige of the conflict between Muslim Moors and Christians back in Spain. Now, we also might note, just in passing, that the creation of the Marine Corps is initiated in response to Islamic warriors. Namely, it is the Barbary Coast pirates who are following in Muhammad's footsteps. They're raiding caravans, but in this case, ships. They're taking slaves, they're capturing people to be held for ransom, they're demanding protection money from any non-Muslims who didn't want to be raided. And most countries in Europe, and even the US here in its early days, pays the money. But Thomas Jefferson is so bothered by this idea and so irritated and just, it's ridiculous. He asks why Tripoli does this and why they're sending out Barbary Coast pirates, and he's told that it's because it's in the Quran. So Jefferson bought himself a Quran to read, and then when he becomes president, he forms the U.S. Navy, creates the U.S. Corps of Marines, and sends them where? To the shores of Tripoli, right? And they soundly defeat the Barbary pirates in the first foreign war fought by the United States. There's a little irony here, isn't it? We will say repeatedly today, we are not at war with Islam. And we're not at war with Islam. But the first war fought by the United States as a new country is with Islam. We got a little bit ahead of the story. Let's go back. On the whole, it is clear that the Muslim conquest largely follows trade routes. We have a view here of such routes much later on, but even in the 8th century, many of these are largely the same. Now, you can see, can you not, why Indonesia is going to emerge as a strongly Muslim country. It's now the world's largest Arab nation, with 13% of all the world's Muslims living in Indonesia. And Arab warriors were, as a rule, entitled to 4/5 of all the booty in the form of movable goods and people which they could capture in their campaigns. The monies go into a common treasuries. So the economic advantages of being an Arabian Muslim become obvious. If you can get in on this deal, you can enrich yourself and your family by joining others and conquering ships and peoples and making money off of it. It isn't just about the money, though, clearly, because wherever they go, Muslims carry their faith, too. Now, sometimes we've talked about how the Crusades are an example of Christian cruelty, and they were. Let's be honest about that. But in the same way, that what motivates many Muslims for these excursions, many of the Crusaders, at least originally, have a religious motivation. It's just when they get to Turkey and Istanbul and Asia Minor, they begin to see, oh, there's a lot of stuff here we could take back home. And they start doing that. The same thing happens. We'll talk sometime about Crusades. They have been grossly caricatured in most people's modern understanding of them, and sort of reduced down to, well, Christians are just as barbarous as other people. There's something more to it than in fact, all of that. In Jerusalem, the fabled Dome of the Rock is built in 691. It's built on the spot from which the Prophet Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven during a vision. Now, Muhammad's never in Jerusalem, okay? And no one says he is, but he has a night vision in which he goes to Jerusalem, and in his vision, this is where he ascends up to heaven from. Muslims also believe that this is the very rock on which Abraham is prepared to sacrifice his son, Isaac, by the way, not Ishmael. But equally significant, and significant today. It's the spot where Judaism is said to have built the Temple of Solomon. Now, really, if you're just picking a spot because someone had a dream and they thought they were from there, you could easily adjust it over, 10 blocks. If you're picking it because you think this is where Muhammad prepared to sacrifice his son, well, that's not even the son that is a part of your lineage. That's the Jewish son. That's Isaac, not Ishmael. So what's really going on here? Well, it is a simple strategy. It is not simply to take its place as one system of religion among many. Its aim becomes to displace both Judaism and Christianity as the one true faith. Now, this is why when Ottoman Turks capture in 1453 what had been the second Rome of the Christian church, Istanbul, Constantinople, it is a city called after the great Constantine, who is the great Christian emperor, who basically legalizes Christianity in the Roman Empire. They will rename it Istanbul. That's from the Greek, in the city. They thus replace the Byzantine Empire with their own empire. They also appropriate one of the oldest churches in that city, the Hagia Sophia. Let me see if I got that. I'm out of order, I think. The Hagia Sophia, that had been built in 537 AD as the seat, as the headquarters for the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. What becomes that? They will repurpose the Hagia Sophia as a mosque. Remember, it's going both ways now. Christians have repurposed the one in Spain as a cathedral. Muslims will repurpose this Christian church as a mosque. That causes the Eastern Orthodox Christians to say it should be returned to the Christians who built it. I don't know that we really want to get into that, because if you begin to go back and say who had original claim on everything, we will, we'll be in court forever. When the secular government comes to power in Turkey in the 1930s, not an Islamic government, but a secular government, it transforms this building, which had been a church, then a mosque. It transforms it into a museum, which it has been ever since. But now there is a new movement in Turkey to change it back to a mosque, which has caused the Eastern Orthodox Christians to say, well, if you're going to do that, just give it back to us. Stay tuned for how that one ever turns out. Eastward in both India and Pakistan, magnificent palaces, forts, and mosques. This one in Delhi, shown with Muslims celebrating the end of fasting month, were built when the Muslims take control, largely in the 1600s. This one, the Bashari Mosque in Pakistan, built in the 1600s as well. And as most folks are aware, the religious difference between Muslims and Hindus in the Indian region are the very reason why Pakistan is created in 1947, when the British partition that whole area of the world that they've had control over. What we should recognize from all of this is that the current resurgence of what is called militant Islam has a strong historical precedent. This is nothing new. And if you go back to the map that we showed in the first session, the map showing the percentages of the Muslim population, Islam has a very large following among the world's peoples. And we should point out, however, that just as Christianity and Judaism have their internal divisions, Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, for instance, or Reformed Jews, Orthodox Jews, so do Islam has its own varieties. Despite what some would like to tell you, Islam is not now and never has been a strictly monolithic force. As you might expect, the first divisions center around who will lead the movement after Muhammad's death, who will be the successor then. The first four of those caliphs are all men who had been companions of the Prophet, and both the third and fourth of the caliphs were married to two of Muhammad's daughters. That did not exempt them from any criticism, however, especially when it appeared to some that nepotism and corruption were sneaking in. The third such leader, who was Ibrahim ibn Affan, was assassinated by insurgents in his own household after being confronted by a list of all their grievances. Now, this is obviously not a very flattering portrayal of him, but we should note that one of his sayings about charity will perhaps give you a softer view of the man. Your charity is not accepted until you believe. I need the reward more than the beggar needs my money. In turn, his successor, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is the fourth leader, never receives universal acceptance either. And in trying to put down his enemies, Ali transfers the base of operations to Iraq, a place called Najaf. You may remember it from the first days of the Iraqi War, when the 101st Airborne has an encounter there. It is a momentous move because it shifts the center of Islam away from the Arabian Peninsula permanently. Ali can never quite clear himself of suspicions of some, however, that he's been involved in his predecessor's murder. And so there arises a crisis of sorts centered around the question of whether the leadership of the Muslim community should be given down on this sort of favored family basis, hereditary basis. Those who think it should and who favor Ali as the son-in-law of Muhammad, married to his daughter Fatima, become known as the Shia, or partisans of Ali, the Shia at Ali, and of his sons Hassan and Hussein, whom Ali wishes to succeed him. Others, beginning with the succeeders, Kharijites, reject such ideas. They think that's just an aristocratic pretension. They claim that since the Quran sorts out human beings in moral terms, the community of believers should choose anyone they like as its head, providing that he passes the test of piety and consistent moral actions. And Ali, they think, fails those tests. So eventually the succeeders' views win out, and the majority become known as not as succeeders, but by the term Sunnis. And Ali himself, along with both of his sons, as his predecessors had been, are murdered by their opponents. It is no exaggeration to say that the tragedy that befalls the house of Ali has been brooded by some, however, ever since. So bitter are some of the Shiite sects about the great betrayal of Ali that to this day they curse Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, the first three caliphs, as usurpers in their Friday prayers. In the eyes of the Shiites, Muhammad was the divinely chosen prophet of Islam, but Ali was an Imam Mahdi, a divinely appointed and even supernaturally gifted spiritual leader, designated by Muhammad, but also endowed by Allah with special gifts and insight. Now we can draw a rough parallel here to Catholic claims that Jesus gives St. Peter a special place after his death. And even today, Shiite loyalty to imams who can be considered to be in the Mahdi line is fierce, even when they have been outlawed by the majority Sunni Muslims, or even by the main body of the Shiites themselves, because there's at least 5 major divisions in the Shiites, each focused around a particular historical figure and his claims towards inspiration. There are the Twelvers, for instance. That's the largest Shiite group. They are predominant in Iran, where they number 80 million or so, as well as Afghanistan and Iraq, Pakistan. They believe that the 12th Imam of the line of Ali, who disappeared in 878 AD, will come again as Al-Mahdi, the divinely gifted one and the chosen one. It's not a Messiah, to be clear, but he is the true successor to the prophet, who will usher in this period of righteousness and peace before the end of the world. As opposed to the Twelvers, there are the Seveners, or the Ishmaelites, as they're so called, because they're loyal to Ismail, the first son of the 6th Imam, who is set aside by his father for his younger brother when his father is told Ishmael got drunk. The Ishmaelites don't believe that. They suggest that one of his descendants will be that Mahdi one day, unless the line simply died out after him. There are also the Druze who are in Syria, Lebanon. They arise in about 1021. There are the Alawites, or the upholders of Ali, also found in Syria, and they even incorporate some elements of Christianity. They believe in the resurrection of Jesus, for instance. And there are the Zadis, found mostly in Yemen. They are the most conservative. They take their name from the 5th Shia Imam who was deposed. Bin Laden came out of this tradition. Okay. Well, that's a lot. That's even more than Presbyterians, who have several branches. That's even more than the Lutherans, who have Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod. And you get more and more conservative as you go northward. 80% of Muslims today follow in the Sunni tradition, okay? There are 4 schools of thought there, but there are minor differences. The Shafi are a liberalized form of the Maliki school, to the Hanafi, to the Hanbali, those who represent the most strict of this tradition. Saudi Arabians are predominantly Sunnis. Yet even there we can say there are parallels within Islam to say the Puritan movement in the Christian his history. Because beginning in the 18th century, the Wahhabi movement arises in Saudi out of a desire to purify the Islamic faith from the more mystical Sufism, which has attracted many. The Wahhabis reject all modifications to Muslim belief and practice that cannot be traced back to the Quran. In other words, the Wahhabis are, try to stretch with me, fundamentalist Muslims, those who want to go back to the foundations or the fundamentals of it. Within this tradition of Islam, the idea has come that houses and clothes should be plain, that joking music and gold ornaments are forbidden, and even games such as chess must be given up because they make the players forget the hours of prayer. Heaven knows what they would say about the internet. which makes everybody forget everything. So what is Islam? It should be obvious by now that sort of like the Christian faith, it is not just one thing. It is not just one approach. Nor can we define it simply as a set of religious beliefs, because it's clearly also a way of life, and it's an entire cultural complex. Let's go back one more time to those 5 pillars. This declaration of faith that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. Those 5 daily times of prayer, which all Muslims are supposed to follow. The practice of fasting, Ramadan, the welfare tax, or zakat, and the pilgrimage of the Hajj, which can often be the high point of a Muslim's life. In this respect, daily life is the arena in which Islam is put into practice. A Muslim will tell you Islam is about how you live day by day, as well as on a larger scale. So the clearest path for how you live as a Muslim and follow the traditions of that faith is known as the Sharia. That's the clear path. Based upon the Quran, upon the Hadith, which you'll remember we said last time are sort of the sayings of Muhammad, and on the consensus of scholars, all of which are intended to give guidance for every aspect of your life. God is the supreme lawgiver. His laws are intended to give guidance for the whole of creation, not just human beings. But the Sharia is both a personal rule of law and a system of law that confirms the rights and duties given by God. In strictly Islamic nations, the Sharia also forms the legal code for the country. In some nations, it doesn't. And even in the West, there are now conflicts in Belgium and in France and in England and even some a little bit in America, where Muslim communities wish that the Sharia becomes the prevailing legal code for their whole community. Now, in this respect, Islam recognizes 5 categories of human activities. Those which are forbidden, those which are disapproved of, but they're not forbidden strictly. Those which are neutral, it's not important either way. Those which are good are rewarded by God, and those which are obligated to every Muslim. And if you neglect them, that is sin. The forbidden or the haram activities include drinking, wine, stealing, slander, adultery, charging interest, and gambling. That encourages people to put their trust not in God, but in luck. Same reasoning Methodist, will also are against gambling. I know that comes as a shock to some of you, so we'll talk later on. Reprehensible, but not strictly forbidden actions include a divorce. Recommended duties include certain extra prayers and marriage. The obligatory acts, which are those which are the 5 pillars. So the vast majority of things fall into that neutral category. It's neither forbidden nor recommended. You just have to use some wisdom on it. With regard to education, for instance, the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave." That's a good word. And so, using one's God-given intelligence, it is your duty to find out more about how you engage the world, and finding out more is an act of your faith. All learning must be subjected, however, to the will of God, as revealed in the Quran. Any meat that is eaten must be slaughtered in the correct way. And that includes invoking the name of God. This is called halal meat, H-A-L-A-L. And if you drive around our area, you will see halal shops. And what that says to you is that this is meat which has been properly treated and prayed over and has been butchered in the right way according to Islamic law. Pig meat, on the other hand, is strictly forbidden. It's regarded with revulsion by most Muslims. The Quran specifically forbids usury, as we said, but it does encourage trade and making a fair profit, which is described as seeking the bounty of God. Any wealth that you acquire is to be used for the support of your family, and then it is to be given to those in need. Now, these are good things, right? I mean, all of this is good, but there is a darker side to Sharia law. When Sharia law is instituted several years ago in Pakistan, any blasphemy against Muhammad, Islam, or the Quran became a capital offense. And a single accuser is enough to condemn a Christian to death. A single accuser. Now, aside from Sufism, which emphasizes a spiritual state of love and devotion towards God, there is no real tradition of pacifism within Islam. There is in the Christian faith, but there isn't there in Islam. In some respects, Islam is born in violence, and it remains that way. We might note that following the shootings in a Christian church in Pakistan a few years back, that a Pakistani mullah, or a religious leader, published a fatwa, that's a religious ruling, declaring that for every Muslim killed in Afghanistan during the war there, they would kill 2 Christians in Pakistan. Now, the truth is that Islam divides the world into 2 zones. The Dar es Salam are the house of peace, and the Dar al-Harb are the house of war. And this is where it gets a little tricky for us. Islam is not just a religion at this point. It is an ideology with a political agenda as well. It holds that all men are created to live in submission to Allah, as prescribed by Islamic law, and that Islam's destiny is to extend its control until the whole Dar al-Harb, the house of war, is subject to Islam, even if that requires the use of force. In this respect, it is not quite correct to say, as some will, that the word Islam means peace. It is related to the Arabic word for peace, salam, but literally, Islam means to surrender or to submit as a slave to his master. You make peace by laying down one's arms in submission or surrender. And therein lies the origins of what we might call radical Islam. There are clearly passages within the Quran, for instance, that exhort the faithful to fight and kill unbelievers by waging jihad or holy war. Surah 9, 1-3 says, believers make war on the infidels who dwell all around you. Surah 2, verses 2-6 tells Muslims, fighting is obligatory for you as much as you dislike it. Surah 9, 73-95 begins with the words, prophet, make war on the unbelievers and hypocrites and deal rigorously with them. And Surah 2, 190 says, fight in the way of Allah against those who fight against you, but don't begin the hostilities. Lo, Allah loveth not the aggressors. Slay them wherever you find them and drive them out of the places where they drove you out. Other verses promise the shaheed or the martyr status to anyone who gives their life in the way of Allah. That is forgiveness of sins, direct entry into paradise. Like global entry, just no waiting, you just go straight through. We may look at the example of Muhammad, who himself does not hesitate to have his enemies and opponents and his critics killed. As the Hadith really clearly says and records, others within Islam today, many others, condemn acts of violence. They argue that Islam can only be extended by peaceful means. These are the people that are probably our friends and our neighbors. They maintain the Muslims fight only in and protection of themselves, though that definition has been pushed. Bin Laden was once reported to have said that the terrorism we practice is of the commendable kind, for it is directed against the tyrants and the aggressors and the enemies of Allah. So to justify killing someone, you only have to pronounce him to be an enemy of Allah. That's what happens to Anwar Sadat in Egypt for making peace with Israel. That's why he's assassinated. So we can say that though all Muslims everywhere acknowledge the same creed, in one respect, a very important one, Islam is a religion that is at war within itself over how that creed is to be implemented. I think it is also fair to say that truth is somewhat of a moving target for many within Islam. This is what makes it difficult to have dialogue. We mentioned this morning in the sermons that there is such a thing as absolute truth, as moral truths which are unchanging depending upon one's circumstances, even though 9 out of 10 Americans aren't sure of that. But according to religious teachings of Islam, Muslims may lie on 4 different ways. You can lie to save your life. You can lie to effect peace or reconciliation. That should give us some pause about negotiations, shouldn't it, with an Islamic government. You can lie to persuade a woman. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. You can lie while on a journey or expedition. The principle of Al-Takeyya permits Muslims to lie anytime they perceive their own well-being or the well-being of Islam has been threatened. We're going to come back to that next week some. But what does this say to us? It says that to have meaningful dialogue with those of the Islamic tradition, we need to have our eyes wide open, don't we? Because things such as absolute truth are not so absolute for everybody. Now, perhaps no subject is more fraught with controversy, or in case my kids in England are listening, controversy, than the relation of women and Islam. Traditionalists, most of them men, argue that Muhammad greatly improved the status of women in Arabia in his time. He guaranteed them basic rights in marriage that had been denied to them prior to that time, and that is exactly true. But Muhammad is clearly no feminist, even if we were to accept the sort of juxtaposition of that term backwards. This 15th century Turkish manuscript shows the prophet on a tour of hell, where we see women who let strangers see their hair, hanging by that hair over flames as punishment. Now, within the Quran, there are likewise testimonies as to the legal inferiority of women. A sister shares only half the portion that her brothers do under the Quranic laws of inheritance. Now, let me balance that out by saying that the expectation is that the brothers will take care of the sisters, so you will give them more. It's the same expectation for why in the Old Testament the firstborn is given sometimes a double portion. They're expected to take care of the family. Okay. But the Surah 4 indicates that men are the managers of the affairs of women, for God has preferred in bounty one of them over the other one. Righteous women are therefore obedient for guarding the secret for God's guarding. Those you fear may be rebellious, you should admonish. Speaking of women, you should banish them to their couches and beat them. Now, I want to suggest that there is difficult language in the Old Testament too. There is a psalm which is rather well known about mothers dashing their babies against the rocks. So it's not that the use of violent illustrations says that something's worse than others. But the psalm about mothers dashing their babies against the rocks is a lament over what is coming in the conquest. And it is an attempt to say in a very bodacious way that, you'd do better to just kill your children right now than to let them live through what is coming, because it's going to be horrible for everybody. We can take that with a little different grain of salt then than any place that says, if the women get out of line, banish them and beat them. And all this is to say Islam has a darker side to it, at least from those who advocate the perspective of the kind of freedom which Christ promised unto all people. So how do we relate our faith to those who practice this faith? Well, that is a great question that we're going to come to next week, okay? When I want to talk about the question of, is Allah the same as our God? Are we all worshiping the same God, just calling them different names? I'm going to suggest something to you with respect towards that question. And then I want to suggest to you next week what it is that you and I, who follow the Prince of Peace, who have pledged in our own hearts to be faithful disciples of this one who came, some will say, to divide the world. He will say that, mother and brothers against each other, but who really came that we may have life and have it in abundance. So how do we respond to those whom we believe may be caught up in a system which is going in the opposite direction from the grace-filled understanding of God, which the Christian faith brings? We'll come back to that then. Let's go ahead and close, and then there's a church council meeting and potluck in a few minutes. I have not checked whether any of the meat at the potluck is halal certified, but I think, in fact, I'm pretty sure there's some pork over there. So just be careful as you go eat. Let's pray together. Father, we take absolutely no joy in thinking that somehow we're superior to those of another faith tradition. What we should take, Father, is absolutely all responsibility. That you have called us to be ambassadors of that gospel of grace and love. So forgive us when we have fallen down on that, or when we have allowed things to sort of slide down into he said, she said, when we've allowed ourselves to be at odds with people whom we really should be in love with. Cause us to be people who will step forward in a way that will bring true salam, true shalom, true peace to this world. In the name of Jesus, we pray today. Amen. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week. And if you've missed anything, it's all on the website, so you can go back and can stream it.